They said she was just a supply clerk, nothing more. Just another young woman in scrubs, sorting bandages and alcohol wipes into neat rows, the kind of quiet work no one notices until it's left undone. That's what the receptionist whispered as Riley Carter bent over another box, her sleeves pushed up, her fingers stained faintly red from iodine. They didn't see the scars hidden under her cuff. They didn't know the weight behind her steady hands. All they saw was a late 20s woman in a clinic basement, unpacking gauze and antiseptic bottles, humming faintly to herself, as if this were the only world she'd ever belonged to. But the world was about to remember her name in a way no one there could have imagined. And it began not with sirens, not with chaos, but with a single sound, a monitor's chime. Before we go further, let me ask you something. If you agree that real heroes don't always stand on podiums, that sometimes the truest courage is buried in silence until the moment it's needed, then like this video and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear deserves to be remembered, and it starts right here, with a woman everyone thought they understood. Riley Carter was 28 years old, but she carried herself like someone decades older. Not in her body. Her stride was still strong, her shoulders squared, her jaw firm, but in her eyes. They were the kind of eyes that didn't just look at things, they measured them. The kind that saw shadows move before anyone else noticed the light had changed. Yet in this place, in this small community clinic tucked behind a row of shuttered shops, her eyes meant nothing. She was the girl in supplies. The one who counted syringes, who restocked cabinets, who slipped in and out of rooms without anyone ever stopping her for advice. The truth was, Riley had stopped expecting them to. After all, no one here had ever seen the desert nights she'd survived, the dust storms she'd stitched wounds through, the convoy she'd ridden with her knees braced against crates of plasma. None of them had ever watched life bleed out in minutes unless hands like hers stopped it. And she didn't tell them. She never did. She just clocked in, tied her hair back, and stacked gauze until the shelves were lined like parade rows. Every morning began the same. The clatter of the freight elevator, the squeal of its rusted gate, the faint scent of coffee and bleach lingering in the hall. Riley would roll her cart inside the storage wing, click on the single flickering light, and lose herself in the rhythm of order. Gloves here, tape there, chest seals lined up in their sterile wrappers like small, forgotten promises. Some of the nurses would laugh when they passed her. "You sort like you're waiting for an inspection," one said once, tossing her ponytail as she walked by. Riley only smiled. If they knew how many inspections she'd stood through under burning sun with a colonel's shadow falling over her, maybe they'd understand. But she never explained. Her life outside the clinic was simple. A small apartment with bare walls, a single framed photo tucked face down most nights, because looking at it cost her more than she cared to admit. She cooked the same meals: eggs, rice, black coffee, ate quickly, cleaned slowly. And when the silence pressed too hard, she would open the footlocker at the end of her bed. Inside was a folded uniform, worn but intact. A field journal, its edges frayed, pages filled with notes in her careful hand. And beneath it all, medals. Not many. She had never cared for them. But each one had a story, and each story carried ghosts. At the clinic, no one saw the footlocker. They only saw the steady young woman who never raised her voice, who volunteered for every tedious task, who never left early, never arrived late. Some of the younger interns whispered about her. "She's kind of intense, don't you think? Always so serious." Others shrugged. "She's fine, just quiet." And that was the word that clung to her, quiet. As though silence were weakness, as though composure were absence. But the truth about Riley Carter was this: silence had kept men alive. Silence had steadied her hand when others shook. Silence had been her shield in places where panic killed faster than bullets. And silence was exactly what she gave them now. They mocked, they overlooked, they dismissed, and she said nothing. Because Riley knew what they didn't. Life has a way of testing who you really are when no one else believes in you. And the test always comes when you least expect it. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the high windows and the building buzzed with the dull rhythm of ordinary routine, Riley sat alone at a folding table, organizing the trauma kits she'd prepped for next week's training. Her hair clung to the back of her neck in the heat. A pen rested between her lips as she counted out rolls of tape, jotting numbers into a small notebook only she used. To anyone watching, it was mundane, forgettable, almost invisible. But she worked with the precision of someone who believed every piece mattered, because to her, it did. In another room, laughter echoed, nurses swapping weekend stories, the receptionist scrolling through her phone, a doctor joking about being late to his golf game. None of them noticed the faint electronic hum that shifted in tone. None of them registered the blinking red light on the clinic's central monitor. But Riley did. She heard it like a tuning fork struck deep inside her chest. A sound she hadn't heard in years, a sound so out of place in a quiet community clinic that it made her sit perfectly still. She closed her eyes for a moment. Memories pressed hard against the walls of her mind. Tents lit by lanterns, radios crackling through static, the sound of medevac calls that split silence wide open. When she opened them again, her gaze was locked on the console down the hall. She didn't need to see the words yet. She already knew. What no one else in that building realized was that a line had just been crossed. The routine, the boredom, the dismissal, they were about to vanish. Because the code that blinked across that screen wasn't just an alert. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a call Riley Carter had once lived by, and when it came, you didn't hesitate. You didn't wait for permission. You moved. The screen flickered once, twice, then locked into steady red. The chime grew sharper, faster, filling the quiet halls with urgency no one yet understood. The receptionist frowned, tapping her pen against the desk. "Weird," she muttered, already half ready to dismiss it. But in the supply wing, Riley was no longer sitting. She was standing, kit open, hands already pulling the pieces she knew she'd need first. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She didn't need to. Her silence had always been her preparation, and preparation had just become everything. And that was the moment it began. The moment Riley Carter stopped being the quiet woman in the basement and became, once again, the medic known by a call sign that no one in this clinic had ever heard. The first reaction to the alarm wasn't urgency. It was laughter. From the front desk, the receptionist leaned back in her chair, spinning a pen between her fingers. "Must be a glitch," she said, half smiling as if the flashing red alert were a cheap prank. The nurses gathered near the hallway shrugged, shaking their heads, one even muttering, "Well, that's new. Probably someone hit the wrong button." Their voices floated with the careless ease of people who had never heard that sound before, who had never lived with the weight behind those words. But Riley Carter had. She moved toward the console, not rushing, but with a focus that cut the air around her. "Pull it up," she said quietly, her voice steady enough to silence a few chuckles. When no one moved, she stepped behind the desk and pressed the keys herself. The monitor brightened, flickered, then spilled out a line of text that froze her where she stood. "Falcon Star, medic evac required, now." The room shifted, but not in the way it should have. Confusion, not urgency, filled the space. One of the interns leaned forward, squinting. "What does that even mean?" he asked, his tone laced more with amusement than fear. "Falcon Star? Sounds like a video game." Another nurse smirked. "Yeah, like some bad action movie." Riley didn't smile. Her eyes stayed on the words, her hands already working. Unsealing the trauma kit she'd just packed, laying out a tourniquet, scissors, gauze, chest seals. Every motion precise, automatic, drilled into her bones long before this moment. "Hey," the receptionist laughed, "relax. It's just a system error. Nobody actually uses those old codes anymore." Riley finally looked up, her gaze sharp enough to stop the laughter cold. "That's not an error," she said, voice calm but unyielding. "That's a distress call." The room quieted. They stared at her as though she were speaking a foreign language. "How do you even know that?" one nurse asked skeptically. "What? Did you Google it?" Riley didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence carried something heavier than any explanation. Instead, she turned back to the kit, snapping gloves onto her hands, her movements faster now, more deliberate. From the back of the room, the head physician finally emerged, adjusting his white coat, irritation on his face. "What's going on here? Why is there an alarm?" His voice carried the authority of someone used to being the smartest in the room. "Emergency," Riley said simply. He frowned. No, that system's outdated. I've worked here 10 years, and I've never once." The console chimed again, louder this time. The screen scrolled new text. "Immediate casualty event. Veterans Rehabilitation Center. Multiple injuries. Response code Falcon Star. Priority medical evacuation. Location, South District. The words struck the air like a hammer. Even the doctor fell silent, his mouth hanging half open. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Riley did. She closed the kit, slinging it across her shoulder with a motion too fluid, too practiced to belong to someone who just sorted supplies. She grabbed a second kit, then a third, stacking them into her arms with the certainty of someone who already knew how many she'd need. The physician finally found his voice. "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," Riley said firmly. "You don't have time to debate this." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried command. The kind of command that left no space for questions. The interns blinked at her, startled. For the first time since they'd met her, Riley wasn't the quiet woman in the corner. She was something else entirely, something sharp, unshakable, and terrifyingly certain. "Wait," one of them stammered. "How do you know what to do?" Riley paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "Because I've done it before." And with that, she pushed through the double doors, the weight of 3 medical kits in her arms, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Behind her, silence fell in the clinic. In that silence, the truth began to take shape. She wasn't just Riley, the woman who counted syringes and stocked cabinets. She wasn't just the supply clerk they'd overlooked, the one they teased for being too precise. She was Falcon Star, and the call she had just answered wasn't meant for anyone else. The drive to the South District felt shorter than it should have, though Riley never touched the wheel. One of the clinic's volunteers had insisted on driving, his hands trembling the whole way as sirens wailed in the distance. Riley sat in the back, 3 trauma kits on the seat beside her, silent, eyes fixed out the window. She wasn't looking at the streets they passed. She was scanning, always scanning, escape routes, choke points, the fastest way in and out of a hot zone. Old instincts never die. They just wait. When they pulled up to the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, chaos spilled into the parking lot. A collapsed training scaffold had crushed part of the exercise yard. Dozens were already gathering, nurses screaming for help, veterans trying to drag the wounded out with bare hands, one man pressing his shirt uselessly against another's bleeding chest. Sirens echoed from blocks away, but the ambulances hadn't arrived yet. Riley didn't wait for them. She was already moving, snapping open the first kit, her gloves on before her foot even hit the pavement. Her voice cut through the chaos, not loud, but sharp, steady, impossible not to obey. Pressure on that wound. "Now, you. Keep his airway open. Don't tilt his head. Roll him. Slowly." No one asked who she was. They just did what she said. Her knees hit the gravel beside a man with a crushed leg. Blood soaked through his pants, pulsing fast, every second stealing his life away. Riley's hands moved without hesitation, tourniquet high on the thigh, twist, lock, check pulse. The bleeding slowed. The man gasped, eyes wide, whispering. "You know what you're doing." She didn't answer. She was already reaching for gauze. Another cry tore the air, collapsed the lung. Riley grabbed a chest seal from the kit, tearing it open with her teeth. The interns from the clinic hovered, frozen by the sight of blood, but she didn't hesitate. "Hold the light," she ordered, and they did, their faces pale. With practiced precision, she sealed the wound, pressed down, listened for the faint rattle of breath. It steadied. For 20 minutes, Riley Carter was everywhere at once, bandaging, directing, lifting, stabilizing. Her voice was calm, her movements exact, her presence the eye of a storm that had swallowed everyone else whole. The chaos bent around her, ordered itself by her commands. And when the first ambulance finally arrived, its crew stopped short at the sight before them. Half a dozen patients already stabilized, triaged, tagged with notes scrawled in black marker on strips of tape Riley had slapped onto their arms. The paramedics looked at her in disbelief. One finally asked, "Who are you?" Riley didn't look up from the floor she was threading into a trembling veteran's arm. "Just the supply clerk," she muttered. But a voice behind her cut in. "No," said a man leaning heavily on a crutch, his face pale, but his eyes fierce. "She's Falcon Star." The words dropped like a stone in water, rippling through the crowd. Heads turned. The name meant nothing to the interns, but the older veterans froze, their eyes widening with recognition. One of them, hair gray, hands scarred, stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Falcon Star? From Helmand Province." Riley finally looked up, her jaw tightening. She said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. A hush spread through the yard. The wounded who could still lift their heads stared at her with something heavier than gratitude. Respect. Reverence. Because they remembered. They remembered the medic who had once pulled soldiers out of burning vehicles, who had stitched men back together under fire, who had refused to leave even when her own evacuation was cleared. Falcon Star. The call sign whispered intense, spoken in briefing rooms, carried home in letters from survivors. The clinic staff, who had laughed at her precision, stood rooted to the spot. The receptionist's pin dangled useless in her hand. The head physician's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound came out. The woman they had dismissed, overlooked, forgotten, she wasn't invisible anymore. When the last patient was loaded into an ambulance and the flashing lights faded into the night, Riley sat back on the curb, sweat streaking her face, gloves torn, blood staining her scrubs. For the first time all day, she let herself breathe. One of the younger interns approached hesitantly, clutching the empty wrapper of a chest seal she'd tossed aside. His voice was small. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Riley looked at him, tired but steady. "Because it doesn't matter who I was," she said softly. "What matters is who needed me." The words lingered in the air long after she stood and walked back toward the clinic, her kit slung once more over her shoulder. Weeks later, the supply wing where Riley worked quietly was renamed. A small bronze plaque was bolted above the door. The Falcon Star wing, in honor of steadfast service. Riley never commented on it. She never gave a speech, never asked for acknowledgement. Every morning she simply unlocked the door, stacked the kits, and went back to work. But those who had been there, the interns, the veterans, the paramedics, knew. And whenever they walked past that plaque, they straightened just a little. Because silence had once fooled them. But silence had also saved them. And Riley Carter, Falcon Star, remained proof that real heroes don't need a stage. They only need a call.